Despite their positive roles in inclusive economic development, business associations in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus have a limited capacity to advance economic systems that serve all citizens, including vulnerable groups, such as women and young people with limited participation in the economy. The common challenge includes large, well-connected firms that have been able to establish themselves and communicate their interests to local governments through nurtured channels and ties. Besides, the small and medium enterprises are still underrepresented in policy dialogue and unable to advocate for their priorities and rights before the government. This is also worsened by the lack of constructive engagement between the SMEs and local governments on their needs. So I'm pleased to welcome Aleksandr Chumak, President of the Association of Private Employers in Ukraine, Hontz, Deputy Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Center for International Private Enterprise, our partner at RECONOMY, Veronica Cazacu, our Regional Manager for the region of Eastern Europe at RECONOMY, and Bernd Steimann, Development Policy Coordinator at Helvetas, where he supports and advises various projects and local partner organizations around the world, including Eastern Europe, in advocacy and policy dialogue with decision makers in politics, business, and civil society. Aleksandr, what is advocacy to you?
As advocacy is public representation of a certain segment, in our case of business, it is therefore a possibility of influencing decisions made by government authorities at all levels to create comfortable conditions for enterprise development. We work along this line both at the local level with bodies of local self-government and at the national level with legislative authorities.
Why SMEs are still underrepresented in policy dialogue and are unable to advocate for their priorities and rights before the government?
Let me go back in time. We established our organization back in 2010. It was a grassroots move on the rebound of protests against the adoption of a new tax code. That November, I had a nice experience when, and it was the first time in the history of Ukraine, the current president and prime minister appeared on our Maidan protest. Then the president had one rather simple question to us. He commissioned the prime minister to collect proposals from the entrepreneurs and take them into consideration during decisions making. It was then when it emerged we had no proposals to hand in. That is, no proposals on paper with respective rationale and calculations to corroborate what exactly should be made to make us feel better, just some slogans. Since then, we have set about creating business associations, lots of them new, to gradually move towards it. In 2010 through 2013, we received vital assistance from the site in the framework of their Business Association Development Program. To this day, I know of around 30 organizations that are rather professional in this area and appeared thanks to the program. Still, this is critically not enough for today. Moreover, there are critically not enough of organizations representing exactly small businesses. We do have organizations that represent interests of medium and large businesses. These are not just represented at all government levels. They have their own MPs, say in the Verkhovna Rada, lobbying for their interests. And they can afford them because in terms of resources, it's not a burden. how to put it in Russian, not a problem. This is a problem for micro and small businesses. First of all, because as of today, we are still not financially sustainable. Members' dues make just 70% of the organization's budget. Unfortunately, Ukrainian small businesses have no culture of supporting expert platforms professionally engaged in advocacy. This is quite a problem. As I have already mentioned, these organizations that professionally work with it are few and far between. And the last point to make, protests that flared in autumn of 2019 because of the government's attempts to exert stronger control over micro and small businesses showed once again the issue of absent professionalism. On the back of it, more organizations emerged and became officially registered, riding on that wave of elation, that high. I'm working with some of them now. They have a CEO and a seal, but when it comes to professionalism, things turn really sour. Essentially, they need the same program the site offered a decade ago to build their professional capacity and create organizations with professional approach towards advocacy able to lobby interests of small businesses. Not to forget about authorities, though. They have always been lukewarm to collaborating with small business associations because, first of all, these are deemed not influential. Secondly, recent changes in the government after the presidential, the parliamentary, and local elections show quite a substantial erosion of the level of professionalism among people's representatives. Why? Because the public, the voters, keep looking for a savior with some manna from heaven to share. And they vote not with their brains, but with hearts. This leads to a situation when, the president has just established a council of entrepreneurs with a presidential office and task forces in regions. Local administrations included in these task forces, business representatives with a complete lack of experience and no real influence on business communities in those regions. There are a couple of guys, again, side school representatives, who effectively shoulder all the work. This also creates extra burden in terms of time and professional load, and does not allow lobbying and advocating our interests in a more efficient way.
Large, well-connected companies have been able to establish themselves and communicate their interests to local governments through nurtured channels and ties. Besides, SMEs are still underrepresented in policy dialogue and unable to advocate for their priorities and rights before the government. How are you going to change this, Eric, in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus?
Thanks for the question, and it's a difficult one to answer. And a lot of this has to do with overall the underrepresentation of SMEs in general in the economy. If we look at the economies of Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, SMEs have typically constitute a smaller percentage of overall economic activity in those economies vis-a-vis the Western kind of developed nation model. And as we know, in many emerged economies around the world, that these small mid-sized firms, they provide the bulk of employment opportunities, and they provide the bulk of innovation in the economy, where new ideas are grown, hatched, new business models tried out. So traditionally, due to the post-Soviet nature or the Soviet heritage of these three countries, there's been a strong interest of the state or kind of state-affiliated companies or state-friendly companies and the affiliated oligarchs throughout the region. And these companies have been able to advocate, if you want to call it that, for their position. They've effectively captured a good section of the economy and built a moat around their businesses and their business models. The SME sector, because of aggressive tax authorities, this rent seeking from the state and state officials, the SMEs typically in this region have wanted to be quiet, have wanted to keep their heads down, just do their business and just get on. Now we're a generation away from the events of 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. A full generation has matured in these independent states. And quite frankly, the business climate is changing. You add on top of that the financial crisis of 2008, and on that, the pandemic of 2020 and COVID. And small and medium-sized enterprises now realize that if they're not going to advocate for their interests and stick up for themselves, then nobody else is going to do it for them. And what we have is a realization in the last 10 years or so that the SME community really needs to come together and advocate for its interests. Otherwise, there's just going to be no change to the status quo.
Can we make the advocacy system more inclusive, Bernd?
If you ask me in such a general manner, yes, absolutely. I think we at Helvetas, we strongly believe that policy dialogue, public-private dialogue can work under certain circumstances, and that's why we have been engaging in policy dialogue advocacy for the last 10 years when we really stepped up our engagement regarding policy dialogue. So we think there is always a way to make change happen, to convince policymakers, decision makers, be it in the private sector, in the public sphere, or also in the civic, civil society, to convince them of certain issues, to make our voice heard, and to make change happen. But I mean, it always depends very much on the specific context. What kind of other actors are there? What kind of vested interests are around? How responsive is the state to demands from the private sector, from small and medium business, also from civil society? What kind of avenues do we have to reach out to decision makers and to convey messages?
And what's your experience as an advisor on advocacy?
My experience as an advisor, I have been working as an advocacy advisor with Helvetas for the last 10 years, is that in many of our projects around the world, but also what I see of the work of our local partners, is that we often do not invest sufficient time and resources in really understanding this context, you know, the political, the economic, the social context. We often tend to just start working, get going, because we are so eager to do things. We are very motivated with our issue, that we do not invest sufficient time in analyzing and understanding the context in which we operate. And that's why we often end up in a situation where we do not fully understand what is going on around us and why certain actors are taking certain decisions. So I think it's really crucial to invest some time and resources to analyze the political, the social, the economic context, so we know what we have to expect, and so we can identify the entry points, windows of opportunity where we can start with our advocacy and policy work. And I mean, this not only includes like laws and regulations, so the whole like formal part of the context, but it also includes informal norms, values, beliefs, practices, what people actually do. So there is always like a legal side and the formal side of things, but there is also the informal aspect of the context, which is often even more important, because we know that people say certain things, but they do something different, or there are certain laws and regulations, but in practice, we know they are not always implemented. They are interpreted in many different ways by different state representatives or people from the private sector. And understanding these practices and informal values and norms is really important. And this is an endless process. This is not something you do at the beginning of your engagement, but you just keep doing it. You keep asking questions and you keep being curious because you really want to understand in which context you operate. And then I think it is possible to make a change and to reach out to relevant people.
Now, I would like to use this intermission before we go to Veronica to talk about RECONOMY's value addition, to invite our special guest from the RECI project in Albania, project manager Edlira Muedini. Edlira, could you tell us briefly what your project does in advocacy?
Yes, RECI, it's a youth employment project that aims at facilitating employment of young people into jobs through two main directions. The first one, by creating new jobs for young people, and where we work with the private sector. And the second focus is by increasing the employability of young people. And there RECI works with institutions who offer information and services on the labor market, as well as with institutions that offer training for young people. So these are the two main focus of our work: creation of new jobs for young people and preparing young people for these jobs, so increasing their employability. Advocacy is an important element in our work, and I believe in general in project of development cooperation. We work in advocacy in two main directions again. So the first one is to increase the awareness of young people for certain services. In our case, is for career guidance services. So first, to understand what career guidance services mean, what they are for young people, because I should say in Albania, this is a new service, relatively new services. So the career guidance services are offered at universities, for example, but not at the early stage, and not, for example, as we are introducing now a new career guidance service as community service in the municipality level. And from that perspective, we are working how young people first understand it, and second, how they can advocate to various cities, municipalities to offer career guidance services, because we are piloting it in Tirana. Another case is where we work for, we use advocacy to reach an incentive for a business community. And here, for example, we had back in 2015, support to business association to reduce cost of production in farming. That in exchange, that farmers could offer valuable information for the sector, like production, size of land, contracts, their registration. So they are, how to say, from one side, they offer reduced cost to farming, to production, to farmers, which can increase their incomes and make them more work more and make more money. And from the other side is they offer to the government useful information that they can use for decision making, and also helps the sector to have fair competition, to formalize.
Veronica, what's the value addition of RECONOMY?
So actually, RECONOMY just not just aim for general improvements in the business environment system in the countries Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. The goal of RECONOMY actually is to improve the business environment for young people and women in particular. And this means that RECONOMY does not aim to improve the general advocacy in performance of the system, of the business support organizations from the mentioned countries, but also to deliver the improvements in advocating for these regulations and laws which are relevant for young men and women. In fact, what I want to mention is that RECONOMY aims to create sustainable, systemic change in the business environment. So this is one of the main priority of RECONOMY. And this means tackling the underlying systemic failure in the business environment system as a whole. And what is also important to say that rather than trying to directly fix business environment constraints, or directly performing a function in the system, RECONOMY works to leave behind a stronger business environment system.
How can we address the issues in a sustainable and scalable way?
In order to catalyze systemic change, RECONOMY actually acts as a facilitator. So our aim is to strengthen the capacities, also the incentives and the relationships of local actors in the system. In this regard, RECONOMY focuses to facilitate private sector-led, bottom-up and evidence-informed advocacy functions and supporting target groups and private enterprises to increase their participation and voice, and in this way having better access to the economic opportunities. So the pilot approach is public-private dialogue as a system where policies, regulations, administrative procedures are actually influenced by interactions between a wide variety of individuals and institutions. So in this regard, the pilot contributes to improving the process of reform rather than just the result. So for this reason, the pilot prioritizes 3 entry points. So we call them functions, rules, and norms. So first is to support the capacity development of private sector enterprises. And here I would say in particular, this kind of organizations and business support organizations, business membership organizations, Chamber of Commerce, federations, unions, etc. So to support them to identify and prioritize key areas of inclusive economic development. The second entry point is to facilitate the understanding and appreciation of the value of public-private sector dialogue. So here we speak about those that are small scale, so micro, small and medium enterprises. And this is done by analyzing and paying particular attention to deep-seated political, economic, and power factors that shape inclusive economic development. And this remains embedded actually, in fact, in local patterns of political behavior. So here we are speaking about so-called informal rules, values, and norms. The third entry point is support bottom-up and evidence-informed processes by working with other market stakeholders, for example, with media outlets, with various research organizations. Also, we think to partner with academia, with various think tanks organizations, and this will be done in order to improve the access to policy and all the regulatory information, and also to stimulate and inform the dialogue with the public sector. So, in other words, RECONOMY works to leave behind a stronger business environment system that will generate better employment and increase in income, especially for small and medium enterprises.
There's also the regional dimension of RECONOMY.
In this regard, partner organizations which are involved in this pilot project in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, they will share lessons and best practices and engage in policy dialogue with the other relevant organizations, for instance, with the relevant European Union institutions and the various counterparts in the private sector. So just to mention that if advocacy and analytical skills of business associations are improved, and in the same time, data and analysis which are supplied by the business associations to the government organizations and the government authorities is enhanced, and the quality of the dialogue among those two type of actors, so the supply side and the demand side, if the dialogue is increased and improved, then of course we will have improved regulations and standards that would address the needs of the target group. So in this regard, we talk about the women and the young people, and also the private people, private businesses. We will have higher participation by the target groups and the increased voice of private business in informed policy making dialogue, and the decisions which will be taken by having this kind of joint dialogue. And of course, we will have a better regulatory environment, especially for small and medium enterprise growth, its development, employment, and of course, economic opportunities.
In your opinion, Eric, how has the pandemic affected the SME's position to advocate before the government? Has the pandemic made the larger companies stronger in terms of communicating their interests to local governments?
Yes and no. Maybe that's an economist's or a lawyer's answer. But the strong companies are in a good position, quite frankly, to advocate for their interests. What we do see is really unprecedented activism among the SME business community to really demand their rights. And these are, the owners of the corner kiosk down the street, a small restaurant chain in a city, a regional city, and they're really advocating for their rights. Now, you put this in opposite to the state interests in health and society and keeping the population healthy. And we really have a conflict set up between these small enterprises that were surviving day to day, low cash turnover, that sort of thing, and these kind of larger state-affiliated, state-friendly businesses throughout the region. And the pandemic has driven the SME business community into one another's arms. They've really understood that if they're not going to be active and voicefully advocate for their rights to exist as businesses, then no one else is going to do it for them. They're going to be run over by larger businesses, by regulators, by tax inspectors, and by the state and its interests. We see silly rules coming into place, in effect in Ukraine over this past week, where even larger businesses were affected by these seemingly these regulations that were pulled out of thin air. So for example, you can go into a supermarket to purchase produce, but you can't purchase masks. Or you can go to the health clinic to purchase the medicine that you need. Fair enough. But while you're in the same health clinic, you can't buy hair dye, or you can't buy a pair of scissors or any bandages. And so these regulations came down from on high, and they even affected the larger businesses in Ukraine. And it really undermines the confidence in the effectiveness of the state to regulate the economy, or to kind of intervene in the economy on the behest of citizens. Secondly, if you can't enforce the regulations, which the Ukrainian authorities just are not in a position to do, unenforced regulations effectively make all regulations ineffective. If there's no way to say that this is the law, this can be done, and this is the law, this cannot be done, and to effectively implement that regulation, then there's really no point in making the regulation to begin with, because if you have no effective implementation, then it degrades or denigrates all the rest of the regulation that's on the book.
Back to you, Bernd. Are development initiatives making a difference in inclusive advocacy?
I have to say yes, because I'm working for a development initiative, and I strongly believe that we can make a difference, yes. Because I think the added value of development initiatives is that they often work at the intersection between the state, the private sector, and civil society and also academia in some cases. So I think development initiatives are really well positioned to somehow build alliances, build coalitions, also between allies and partners who might not be partners at first sight, maybe surprising allies, between the private sector and civil society organizations, for instance. That's not always like a natural alliance between the two. So I think this is a real added value for strong advocacy, because if partners across different sectors, they can find a common voice, they can unite behind a common issue, and they can start advocating for it, I think that can make it really strong.
Could you provide an example from your work in the past?
A couple of years back, we did a training on advocacy for programs and projects of Helvetas in East Africa. There was a workshop in Tanzania. And on the very first day of the workshop, we asked people to talk about their political context and to try to make it as explicit as possible, write it down, draw a picture how it looks like. So people told us that, well, why should we do that? We know all about the political context. We know how politics work in our country. And there was a team from Tanzania, 8 people. They used to, they have been working together for like 5 to 6 years already. They sat down on a table, not very motivated because they thought they knew it all. And then they would go on for hours and they would not stop talking and discussing. And when we tried to stop them because we wanted to go for lunch, they told us, okay, we have actually never sat down together to discuss about politics in our country. And we just realized that we have starkly different perceptions. We have completely different opinions of how power and politics work in the country. And it's so good to make this explicit, because we were just assuming that we all had the same ideas about politics. But now that we try to make it explicit, we just realized that we have completely different perceptions and views, how things work, where good entry points are, who are relevant actors, how laws are being drafted and put into practice. And that was a really good lesson also for me, that we need to sit down and make things explicit.
All right. Thank you for watching another round of Inclusive Plot powered by RECONOMY. So, what do you think? Please send us your feedback in the comment section below. We have interesting topics coming up, so stay tuned and hit the subscribe button. This was Sabine, a communication manager at RECONOMY, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Thank you for tuning in and see you soon.